is Citizen Strangers, Palestinians and the Birth of Israel's Liberal Settler State, which is the title of this book by Professor Shira Robinson. Shira works on the social and cultural history of the modern Middle East with an emphasis on colonialism, citizenship, nationalism, and cultures of militarism after World War I. She joined GW, which is right down the street, in 2007 after 2 years of teaching at the University of Iowa and 1 year as a visiting fellow at the Davis Center for Historical Studies at Princeton University. She received her BA in Middle Eastern and North African Studies from the University of Michigan and her master's and PhD in history from Stanford University. The topic of the book and the talk today is in many ways historical, but also very contemporary given the current discussion around the negotiations, the issue of the Jewish state, and the often discussed identity crisis in Israel between being a Jewish state and a democratic state. And I think that in the conversation today, as she's pointed out very emphatically in her book, the origins of this identity crisis really go back to the foundation of the state. And so we're very happy to have Professor Robinson here to talk to us about this issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Yusuf, and thanks to Tamara, and thanks to everyone for coming. It's a pleasure to speak at the Palestine Center. I'm just going to jump right into it. Today, as many of you know, and probably the reason why many of you are here, Palestinian citizens of Israel are in the news a lot, particularly, of course, in the blogosphere, but also even in the mainstream press. The laws and institutions that discriminate against them, and their own growing protests and legal battles, both on their own and in conjunction with Jewish allies. These things today are regularly in the news, whether it's the ban on marriage between Palestinian citizens and their partners from the West Bank or the Gaza Strip, their challenges to Jewish National Fund land policies that prevent them from buying or living on or leasing land owned by the Jewish National Fund, which is about 93% of state land, the harassment of Palestinian Knesset members, the harassment of Palestinian activists who want to commemorate the Nakba of 1948, ongoing government efforts to divide Christians from Muslims from Druze, all of whom, in this case I'm talking about, are citizens of the Israeli state. But this is a very different political landscape and media landscape compared to the landscape that I faced 15 years ago when I began my graduate studies at Stanford. And I just want to talk a little bit about the questions that inspired this book. And by that, what I mean is I want to talk a little bit about the literature that existed at the time I started my work, because the book is actually as interpretive as it is empirical. So the book, Citizen Strangers, developed out of my doctoral dissertation, which itself was spawned by a shorter paper that I wrote in graduate school on an Israeli border patrol massacre in a village of Palestinian citizens known as Kufr Qasim on the eve of the 1956 war, on the eve of the attack by Britain, France, and Israel on Egypt. And one of the major themes to emerge from the archives and the Arabic and Hebrew press on this massacre was the extent to which the narrative of the crime, the aftermath of the crime, and the narrative that was told about it was contested, both discursively, that is, in the press, in the Knesset or Israeli parliament, in petitions, and physically contested between activists on the one hand, and the regime, the Israeli government and its various police and military police and their supporters on the other. And these contestations took place in venues like demonstrations, memorial marches, and elsewhere. And so there were certain questions that kind of were raised for me as I was doing this archival research. For example, one of them was the massacre an isolated crime? That is, the massacre of 48 citizens of Israel from this village of Kufr Qasim. Was this massacre an isolated crime carried out by a few soldiers who, in the words of the Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion at the time, had, quote-unquote, lost their minds, or was the massacre a structural effect of the harsh military regime that had been imposed on Palestinian citizens since 1948, as activists claimed? Second question that was raised for me was, what rights did Palestinians who had been promised equality in Israel's Declaration of Independence, what rights did they have to publicly and openly protest their collective subordination at the time, that is, in the late 1950s? And what rights did they have to express their critique of the political status quo? This degree of contestation, both discursively and physically, surprised me quite a bit, because the secondary literature on Israel before 1967, that is, before Israel occupied the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and the literature on Palestinian citizens that existed, rarely mentioned active Palestinian resistance to Israeli policies and to the conditions imposed on them, and it rarely mentioned the ways in which the state was forced to respond to those acts of resistance. So, I don't want to be too professorial here, but I just want to mention a few things to characterize this literature. Until the 1990s, the field was divided into basically two schools. Let me see if I can do this. Okay, so one school, the first school, which started to sort of produce works in the late 1960s, 70s, maybe a little bit even before, was written largely by former Arabists, that is, government officials who had been responsible for what the government called Arab affairs. And these studies tended to track patterns of demography, voting, and whether or not Palestinians had what they called a positive identification with the Jewish state. And that was very unclear to me. Was that supposed to be a feeling? Could it be measured by an answer to a yes or no question? It was all very vague. Above all, this literature had very, very little to say on the military regime, which was an 18-year regime rooted in British emergency laws, substantial harassment and violence that targeted at the people subjected to it, which were exclusively Palestinian citizens, and a permit system that restricted Arab mobility, residence, farming, work, and political life. So, for example, this literature spoke nothing about the government's use of informants, intimidation, and bribes to conservative clan heads to undermine what might have been democratic elections. When the military government did appear, and so here are just some pictures of searches for people, look to see if they have proper paperwork and permits, and I'll talk more about this in a minute. When the military government did appear in the existing literature that I'm in this first school, or in other studies of Israel before 1967, the military regime was treated as a security matter, either on the one hand, or as a structural exception to Israel's otherwise democratic state formation, and as a structural exception, certainly, to the history of the Jewish settlement enterprise in Palestine. In other words, everything that it said about this military regime was disconnected from the pre-48 period, from the 7 decades or so of Zionist settlement in Palestine before 1948. Now, the problem with this absence or sort of minimalization of the military regime was that the silence defied empirical reality on several levels. First and foremost is that it defied reality in the realm of land. During the 7 decades prior to statehood in 1948, Jewish land agencies and individuals had managed to purchase just under 6% of Palestinian land, the total land of British Mandate Palestine, for their exclusive use by Jews. However, after 1948, less than 2 decades later, this Israeli state claimed title not only to all the land that had been confiscated from refugees that were no longer in the state, but to 65% of all the land holdings owned by Arab citizens inside the state. They did this through a variety of mechanisms, and here's a map from my book that's a little bit, this is the only slide with a lot of text on it, so I apologize in advance, but it's just because it's hard to read it might be a little hard to read the legend. The way that land was confiscated from Palestinian citizens of the state was that the military government basically set up a host of what it called closed zones. And in fact, in the immediate aftermath of 1948, there were about 45 such closed zones that were set up. There were three main districts of military rule, basically north, center, and south. The north was in this area, I don't know if there's a pointer here, but in this area of the Galilee, I tried to shade it in pink. The middle or center area was the area known as the Little Triangle, which was not conquered during the war directly, but was annexed in May of 1949 from Jordan as a part of the armistice agreements between Israel and Jordan. And then the area in the south was in the Naqab or Negev Desert, and this was actually an area where all of the remaining population, which was a Bedouin population, were forcibly concentrated into an area that in Hebrew, the translation would be the reserves, just like the Indian reserves. So one of the things that the military government did is it set up these military zones, and within them closed zones, many other multiple zones, and then said, as soon as we hereby declare this zone closed, no one can move in or out of that zone without a special permit. And you can't work land, you can't look for a job, you can't go visit your mother, you can't go to the doctor, you can't go to university. You need a permit to do absolutely everything. So this was one of the main ways that the government managed to confiscate land through a variety of legal mechanisms, but first and foremost using these military mechanisms. Now, at the time, the government claimed that the zones were universally enforced, meaning if Jews were living in these zones or they were traveling through them, they also needed permits. In other words, they claimed that the zones were enforced through borders and land and mapping, not by race per se. But that wasn't true, and I'll talk about that and how that sort of came out. The government basically admitted that this was a false claim by the late 1950s. Another thing that I want to just mention here is the key to the story of military rule and to the structure of it was that in these zones of military rule, which controlled the lives of about 90% of Palestinians who remained inside the state after 1948, it was not the Knesset that was sovereign. It was the governor. So it was a military governor that was sovereign. And so all of the rules of law that applied to Jewish citizens outside the zones of military rule were suspended inside. And the military governor had a kind of arbitrary rule of law in which he and his associates made all of the decisions. Now, looking at these maps, let's see, I'll go back here for a second. Looking at these maps, and especially at this first one where you can see how much land was owned by Jewish land agencies and individuals before 1948 and then how much land was conquered during the war and annexed, it's not hard to imagine how colonization was so much more significant after 1948 than beforehand. And that's sort of counterintuitive because we think of the pre-48 period as the period of colonial settlement and less so the post-48 period. And in fact, state leaders made this point regularly, particularly when they were under fire by their own, by Jews in the Knesset in the early 1960s, who basically said, oh, the military regime is being used to win votes for the ruling party. And sort of the last stand, the last resort when pushed up against the wall of people like Ben-Gurion and his close associates like Shimon Peres, what they finally said at the end of the day was, look, without military rule, we would not be able to continue our ongoing struggle for the continuation of what they called hityashvut and aliyah, which means simply colonization or settlement and Jewish immigration. So they said this openly in the newspaper in 1962. What about security? In one of the things that was claimed in the early years of military rule was that these military zones and the permit system, on the one hand, they were universally enforced, but on the other hand, they were absolutely necessary for security, both to deter Palestinians who remained in Israel from taking up arms or collaborating with with armies outside of Israel, Arab armies, in sabotaging from within, or from clashing with Jewish citizens. In the sense of the regime's ability to protect Jewish citizens, the military regime's ability to protect Jewish citizens from physical harm and to protect the state from actual sabotage, the security value of the military regime was contested not only by Palestinians and their Jewish allies on the left, but by the security services, the Shin Bet, and a small number of even government Arabists from the earliest years of the state. As the editor of the government's main Arabic daily newspaper put it as early as 1950, quote, "They turn up too few of our flags and have spied too little." This doubt about the security value of the military regime would widen, especially by late 1958, when both the state comptroller and the Supreme Court in Israel would confirm Palestinian long-standing complaints of the racial enforcement of the military regime's permit laws, and political and military elites in Israel began to worry that Israel's international image, was suffering because of the reputation that was emerging of Israel's racial enforcement of the military regime. Here's a picture that I found in the Israeli military archives of a makeshift military court. They were all makeshift. This trial happened to take place in a village in the northern central region of the country, the Northern Triangle, Umm al-Fahim. And research since this period has shown that the Palestinian population that was brought to military trial on violations of the military emergency laws that I mentioned before, they were convicted overwhelmingly on administrative infringements. In other words, not security infringements, trespassing, traveling to sell their produce in a market without a permit, etc. And that for that reason, they were only fined or maybe briefly detained. But they weren't put in jail because there was no security threat to the state. Indeed, we now also know that there was a quiet agreement in the Knesset, or Israeli parliament, in 1952 not to enforce the emergency regulations against Jews in exchange for burying what had then been an ongoing attempt to write a constitution. So the claim early on that this was a security issue and not an issue of discrimination was bunk from the start, and we have all kinds of evidence to prove it. There were claims to that effect from the start, but now we know even more about that. So that was this first school of literature, totally dissatisfying, ignoring the reality of military rule, ignoring the fact that there was this huge colonization of land, etc., and ignoring the regime itself. Then there was a second school of literature that emerged starting in the late 1960s, but especially in the 1980s. And here there were a handful of books, invaluable books, in fact, on the social, economic, and political mechanisms that were put in place by the government to control the population. Except for one of them, a book by Sabri Gidias, The Arabs in Israel, which came out in 1969, very few of these books actually, interestingly, focused on the pre-67 period. In other words, they focused on discrimination and against Palestinian citizens and on the policies that disempowered them and marginalized them, but they didn't talk about the pre-67 period very much. And these books also tended to rely on published laws and other published sources, often government-authored in both English and Hebrew. Now, part of this was a problem of archival declassification. Things weren't open yet. Part of this was a problem of language. But it was a striking absence in the field, nonetheless. And what this literature failed to do is that it really gave very little sense of how military rule as a regime developed in tandem with dynamics between Palestinians and the state, how the imposition of these emergency laws affected everyday life, how Palestinians responded to it over time, and the nature of its legacy. In this sense, the best works that we had in the field produced, unfortunately, a relatively static picture with no meaningful sense of change over time, and a picture that failed to show how and in what context policies and laws emerged. This absence of dynamism from the picture in the relationship between the Palestinian minority and the state, and between Arab and Jewish citizens, and the silence on Palestinian citizens before 1967 in general, was especially striking to me in light of the transformation occurring in studies of Israel-Palestine at that time. And I'll just make one more brief remark about historiography, and then I'll get into my story. So for decades, scholars had been charting the rise of the Zionist movement in three contexts, basically. In the context of anti-Semitism, in the context of nationalism, and to a certain extent in the context of socialism. And of course, each of these factors played a role, but the problem was that there was an over-focus on Eastern European ideas and formal claims by the Zionist movement, and that emphasis on ideas and claims tended to come at the expense of empirical realities and encounters in Ottoman Palestine between Jewish settlers and Palestinian residents. And that focus on ideas and claims at the expense of realities could not adequately explain very important developments that we needed to understand. Things like the emergence of the labor market in Palestine, especially starting from in the 1920s, settlement patterns, the relationship between the Zionist movement and the British Mandatory Authority, and all of this led to a situation in which Israel and the pre-Israel history kind of seemed to exist outside of world history. Now, in the 1990s, when I got to graduate school, there was a new school of work on sort of Israel-Palestine writ large that departed from this more narrow model by foregrounding the mutual impact of the encounters between settlers and the 95% Arab majority that lived in Palestine at the time. And this study of the encounter raised new questions inspired by the study of European imperial expansion since the 16th century and especially since the 19th century. Specifically, the new evidence uncovered by scholars in the field challenged the wisdom, the accepted or conventional wisdom, of the complete separation of the Arab population and the Jewish population. And yet still, notably, this new literature skipped over Israel's first 2 decades of independence, the 1950s and the 1960s. In other words, it focused on the pre-48 period and the continuities between that period and the period in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip after 1967. So, to sort of sum that up, together, both the old literature on the Arab minority, or what was called Arab Israelis, and the new work on Israel-Palestine reinforce the absolutely illogical notion that the laws and practices that Israel used to control occupied Palestinians after 1967, that those institutions and laws emerged in a vacuum. And that is just illogical by basic historical methods of basic historical reasoning and even basic reasoning. So this presented me with a puzzle, okay? Now, to be fair, why was this period absent? Now, to be fair, at first glance, this sort of black hole on the pre-67 period or pre-67 Israel in the context of empire and settler colonialism made sense on 3 levels. Number 1, Palestinians after 1948 who remained inside the state gained citizenship and the right to vote. That doesn't sound like South Africa. That doesn't sound like Native Americans in the 19th century. That doesn't sound like Algerian Muslims in Algeria. After 1948, the Palestinians who remained in Israel were also a native minority, not a majority among the population. Okay, so that's different. And of course, Israel had no metropole. So what do you do? So there are these sort of unique factors that seem to position Israel outside of the discussion, and yet, okay. So that's at first glance, but I would argue, and I do argue in my book, that the failure to situate this period, the 1948 to 1966 period, military rule ended just 6 months before the 67 war, and I'll talk about that at the end. The failure to situate this period and the military government as an institution within the same trends of imperial history defies basic logic and historical reasoning. Why do I say that? Back to the map. Okay, again, it bears repeating that the state acquired exponentially more Arab land for exclusive use by Jews during the first 2 decades of statehood alone than the Zionist movement acquired through purchase in the previous 7 decades. It did so, the state acquired this land largely through a governing apparatus, military rule, that was based on British imperial law which originated in places like India, Ireland, Jamaica, and South Africa during the Boer War. That's number 1. Number 2, the government looked explicitly to colonial models, to French models, to British models in Algeria and India, etc., for things like education policy. How are we going to educate the Arab population in such a way that they are loyal to us, that they don't unite, that they don't have unite or have sympathies with their Arab neighbors outside, with refugees. And they worked hard, looking to colonial models, to institutionalize, the government has worked hard to institutionalize and deepen divisions between different ethnic and religious groups among the Palestinian population. So here's a picture of a Druze soldier on leave at home, but still in his army uniform. Presumably this is in the Galilee. The Druze, basically in the 1950s, the Druze, through an agreement with a handful of conservative community members, were drafted en masse by force to join the Israeli army. So unlike Palestinian Muslims, Sunni Muslims, and Christians, they are required to go to the army, just like Jews. Indeed, scratch beneath the surface, as I did, for example, in police records, government archives, the press, memoirs, literature, comic strips, film, radio, and there also turns out to be no dearth of evidence that both Jews and Palestinians conceived of their relationship to each other during this time in traditional colonial terms, even if the government officially balked at that analogy in international fora. So what do I mean by this? For example, the government regularly used the language and rationale of racial segregation. The Arabs are primitive, they're dangerous, that we saw in places like Africa and Asia and Australia and the United States. They used this language to justify what they called separate development, lockdown on villages, preventing people from going in and out of their villages, offering lower food rations. There was a period of austerity during the first few years of statehood, and the government offered lower food rations to the Arab population than to the Jewish population. They used this language to oppose elected municipal government inside Arab communities due to the supposed Arab unfamiliarity with the, quote, lustiness of democratic procedures. In the early 1950s, Prime Minister and Defense Minister Ben-Gurion compared the mission of Jewish settlement to the conquest of the Wild West against the Native Americans. You don't actually have to look that far to find this stuff, especially if you read Hebrew, but even if you don't read Hebrew, you can find some stuff. Outside of Israel, the government also went out of its way to circulate misleading images of modernization and uplift, of the modernization and uplift of the Palestinian minority, while opposing UN action in places like Algeria and South Africa, action against equality activists, Algerian rebels, to end colonial rule there, and while demonizing as terrorism the efforts of Palestinian citizens to draw international attention to the structural similarities between the conditions that they lived under and the conditions that other colonial subjects in places like Algeria and South Africa lived under. Now, here's a picture of a great picture from the Associated Press that I think somehow didn't make it into the book, of a May Day demonstration in which Palestinians are expressing their solidarity, demonstrating their solidarity with the Algerian Revolution from 1959 in Nazareth, which was the only remaining Palestinian town to sort of stay intact after the war. Here is a picture of a nighttime evening meeting held by the Communist Party, which I'll talk about in 1 second. A meeting to protest the ongoing maintenance and maintenance of military rule. And here is a picture of some political activists, Palestinian political activists from the Communist Party, distributing the main daily organ of the party, Al-Ittihad, in the 1960s. Now, a handful of, and this was a big source for me, this newspaper, and it was in this source that I found a lot of references to sort of making the analogy between our own condition as Palestinian citizens of the state, even though we have suffrage rights, etc., we feel very much in connection with Black South Africans struggling for equality, Algerians struggling for the end of French rule, etc. A handful of Jewish citizens echoed this critique, saying there's some important similarities going on here, structural similarities And they warned against what one critic called the colonial contempt that plagued Jewish society against Arab society in Israel, drawing comparisons between military rule and apartheid, for example, and referring to the military government explicitly as a colonial regime. These critiques came largely from Jews involved in the Communist Party, which was the only non-Zionist party that allowed Arab citizens to be on equal plane or have equal membership with Jews. So I had this puzzle. On the one hand, there were these structural differences. On the other hand, there was all this evidence pointing to the fact that this kind of looked and smelled like a colonial situation. So in short, I had no explanatory models. I had no comparative models or really theoretical offerings to explain Israel's post-independent state formation and its treatment of Palestinian citizens. And for me, this then presented an analytical puzzle. How was it possible that you could have both a procedurally liberal state, a state in which you allowed citizenship and voting for everyone in the country, or most people in the country, and even a semi-free press, and a despotic colonial system that separated groups of people on the basis of race and cultivated familiar colonial dynamics and sensibilities? To most of us, these things are mutually exclusive. You can't have both a procedurally liberal state in which everyone has the right to vote and is a citizen, and a colonial regime at the same time. Those two things don't usually go together. This very fact, the very fact of this duality of procedural liberalism in the midst of a settler colonial project raised a host of new questions for me. For example, what kind of impact did this duality have on the law, social relations, and public culture of Israel in the pre-1967 period? How did Palestinians and Jews experience this period differently? Were Jews aware of what was going on? To what extent? To what degree were they complicit, average Jewish citizens? What difference in practice did citizenship make? That was a guiding question that I was thinking about as I was writing this book. So to answer these questions, going back to the map, I realized that I needed to dig deeper in a few ways. Number one, I needed to link statehood, the period of early statehood, to the pre-48 settlement period and the war that enabled the establishment of a Jewish majority state. In other words, I needed to take seriously the transition between these two periods alongside the demographic upheaval that accompanied the 1948 war. In basic terms, historians now agree that the Palestinian Arab population went from 2/3 of the total population of British Mandate Palestine in late 1947 to 1/8 of the territory that Israel conquered and annexed after the war, because Jewish militia forces and Zionist militia forces, which later merged into the Israeli army after May of 1948, expelled and encouraged the flight of roughly 90% of the Arab population from within the territory that it conquered. Okay, so that's not really disputed anymore. But for me, the question was, how do I connect what was known as minority policy after the war to this transformation, including very, very critically the decision by Israel in the summer of 1948 to formally bar the return of refugees? And I realized that one of the main things I needed to do to think about this was to account for the changing nature of colonialism itself in the world after World War I, and especially after 1945. And this was a change that was in response to the growing militancy of demands for freedom and independence by colonized populations, and in response to the enshrinement, and which produced, rather, the enshrinement of certain basic human rights norms like suffrage and citizenship. So there were consequences, very important consequences to this shift in the colonial world as it was known in 1945. Number one, the avowal of imperial conquest. I hereby conquer you and I am the imperial overlord. That became much more muted over the course of the 1930s and 40s, and especially after World War II. Number two, Britain and France, just to take two examples of major empires, began to change the names of their ties to their overseas possessions after the war. So it was no longer the British Empire, it was the British Commonwealth, right? So they started to describe the nature of their ties to their overseas territories differently, and both the British and the French began to hand out discrete rights to people in the colonies that they held in order to hold on to them, in order to forestall complete withdrawal. So Algerian Muslims gained French citizenship in the mid-1940s. That's a major example. The French and the British also tried to begin sort of social welfare programs in much of West and Southern Africa in order to forestall demands for independence, things like this. And Israel, as I show in the book, Israeli officials were for the large part very attuned to these trends, which helps to explain why the explicit avowal of colonial rule inside the country didn't appear very much. In other words, I've scratched beneath the surface and given you a few bits, and there's a lot more in the book, but the official language of the time was not what you might expect from for example, from a 19th century British military ruler, something like that. And I also realized I had to use some non-traditional sources, unpublished sources, police records, films. I used a lot of cultural sources as well as newspapers and other things. So these questions became my launching pad for the examination of, or for investigations into law, public culture, and political activism during this period. And I'll speak very briefly about culture and political activism at the end, but here I just want to walk you through the legal section of the book, and particularly the section on the question of suffrage and citizenship. And I don't have the time here. Okay, so I'm just going to talk about the law. So there were two important questions that we need to ask to think about what was going on in the minds of Israeli policymakers. Number one, in 1948, why would they agree to share political power with a population that would want to undo, an Arab population, obviously, that would want to undo the very policies that subordinated them to Jews? In other words, why give people political rights if they might use those political rights to change the laws that subordinated them? But also, why did it take 4 years to pass a citizenship law in Israel? The citizenship law was passed only in 1952, and for the first 4 years of Israeli statehood, there were no citizens. So that's kind of weird, right? And I discovered two things. Number one, both voting rights and the promise of universal citizenship were forced on the Israeli state in order to join the United Nations. Number two, and more important, the 1952 citizenship law was ultimately formulated not to define and secure the ties of the Jewish majority to the state, as you would imagine, it's the Israeli citizenship law, but rather the citizenship law was to limit the right of return of Palestinian refugees and to subordinate collectively the Palestinian population that remained. And this helps to explain, these two little facts help to explain or begin to explain why citizenship as an institution in Israel is so incredibly weak. As with everything else in history, this law, the citizenship law of 52, evolved not, I would argue, not from an orderly program of displacement and exclusion, although there was certainly that logic there, but rather it evolved from a host of structural contradictions and after much trial and error. And I'll just briefly explain that and then I'll end. So when the UN Partition Plan was announced in November of 1947, the Arabs of Palestine were expected or projected to comprise nearly 50% of the population in the Jewish state. And in some cases, places like the Galilee, for example, they were expected to comprise 80 to 90% of the population. And this was supposed to be land allocated to the Jewish state, but they still had an overwhelming Jewish majority because very few Jews had settled there before the war. UN Resolution 181, which was the Partition Plan, would require each state, the Arab state to be and the Jewish state to be, to draft a constitution enshrining political and legal equality and the protection of property of all citizens. Now, we already know that during the war, the Yishuv, or the Jewish settlement community in Palestine, bypass the liability of minority rule, or even 50% rule, through the expulsion and coerced flight of most of the indigenous Arab population. But a sizable population of Palestinian Arabs remained after the war, 15% of the total Israeli population, after the fog of the fighting had cleared, and most of the rest of the Palestinian population remained just over the border. Israel did not want to grant en masse suffrage rights to the Palestinian population, but it was quite worried because in December of 1948, its first UN application was rejected, and the first parliamentary or Knesset elections were coming up in January of 49. There were proposals to limit the vote to certain Palestinian groups, but in the end, everyone in theory was granted the right to vote. There were all kinds of other problems that I don't have time to go into, but I will just say one more thing, which is that as Ben-Gurion, as the Prime Minister and Defense Minister, announced that everyone would have the right to vote in late December of 1948, a few weeks before the parliamentary elections, the government did two things. Number one, he expanded the power of the military government or the military regime to limit the Arab population's ability to farm their land and to contest the confiscation of that land. And at the same time, he tried to reduce the Palestinian population before a universal citizenship law was passed through what he called the war on infiltration, what I call the war on return, and by creating a complex registration system designed to freeze the legal status of Palestinians and to make as many Palestinians as possible subject to possible deportation. Meanwhile, the government stalled for several more years on the citizenship law, because Ben-Gurion feared that the potential to grant equality to Palestinians would undermine the Jewish settlement project. So I've run out of time here, which is shocking, or maybe not shocking, but basically the kind of political formation that Israel became during its formative first 2 decades was what I have called a liberal settler state. And I defined this term as a modern colonial polity whose procedural democracy was established by forcibly removing most of the indigenous majority from that territory and then extending to them individual rights and duties to them. And the main argument of my book is that Israel became a state in which the rights to the state were granted to one group, the Jewish population, and certain discrete rights were given to the Arabs within the state. So there was one group that was granted the rights to the state, that might have been clear, and another group that was granted rights within the state. And that distinction between nationals, what I call nationals and citizens, is very, very important. Now, we don't have time to go into everything else that I wanted to say, but this very distinction between citizens and nationals that I've just suggested is only one of the major structural conditions that Israeli society has faced since the 1948 war. And these contradictions have enormous implications for those people like yourselves who are interested in seeing a final end to this protracted and very tragic conflict. If the long-standing nostalgia still held by so many, at least in this country and elsewhere, for what in Hebrew is known as the small and beautiful Israel, particularly among the left, if that nostalgia is a fantasy, then simply separating Palestinian citizens from the Palestinians in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip and establishing a two-state solution, even if that were possible, which I don't think it is anymore, that will still leave many, many problems in place. Thank you very much.
I just wanted you to go over the Citizen National one more time.
Yes, I'm so glad you asked, because I actually
can understand it. And secondly, I want to ask about a current issue that really delves into the heart of the stranger citizen, because there is a group of Palestinian prisoners that were supposed to be released, or still supposed to be released, on the 29th, which is the day after tomorrow. and they were to include Palestinian citizens of Israel. Now the Israelis are rejecting that. Also, I want your take on this issue because they're saying these are Israeli citizens and may not be eligible to be released with the Palestinian citizen as part of the deal concluded with Kerry. Thank you.
Okay, great. Yeah, okay, so let me address the second point first to say that I didn't know about the the scheduled release of the prisoners, the political prisoners, but I guess that doesn't surprise me because since the early state period, Israel has done everything in its power to separate the Palestinians on the inside of within its armistice lines, its 1949 armistice lines, and the Palestinian population outside. So both in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, but also everywhere in the among refugees in the diaspora. And so, for example, in the I think in 1949 or 1950, basically UNRWA, the humanitarian efforts that UNRWA was carrying out to help refugees. They had been working inside Nazareth, the Galilee, and Akka, and elsewhere to provide for the population that had been displaced during the war. A huge portion of the Palestinian citizens of Israel are actually descendants, either themselves were internally displaced or became refugees during the war, or their descendants were. And basically Israel, as a way of asserting its sovereignty and saying the armistice lines are the final borders and we're sovereign now, they forced UNRWA to cease its operations. So this is a part of that story of Israel saying, Kerry, in this case, Kerry, the United States, the international community, has no business addressing our internal policing or security or political matters. So that's, I'm imagining what that is speaking to. In terms of the citizen and national distinction, and thank you for asking that question, basically, as I was saying before, Ben-Gurion kept stalling. There were 18 drafts of the citizenship law. He had 3 different Knesset committees working for him saying, is this good, is this good, is this good? And he kept saying, no, 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 because God forbid there should be true equality in a state. And he has some great quotes. And for example, there is no automatic citizenship here, he said, and when you forfeit this notion, you commit heresy against the entire principle of the state. We must adapt the juridical form to the national historical content, that is the content of Zionism and the mission of Zionism, and not the reverse. In other words, we're not just going to give everyone born here citizenship because that vitiates the point of the state. And so what happened is the government was stalled, and in late 1949, a religious, an Orthodox Jewish member of the Knesset said, I have an idea. We'll basically separate this, we'll first create a law that connects the Jewish population of the state before we deal with the question of the Arab population of the state. And we'll call that the law of return. And in that law, we will basically say Jews both here and everywhere in the world who want to come here ever will be granted rights to the state forevermore. And once we have that in place, then we can figure out what to do with the citizenship law. So that was passed in 1950, a few months after it was proposed, and Ben-Gurion loved it because it basically said Jews will have kind of preferential rights. They'll have rights not just in the state but to it, right, forevermore. Whereas what happened in the citizenship law, which was eventually passed in 1952, is the first clause of the citizenship law says this applies to everyone except those people to whom the law of return applies. So it doesn't name Jews or Arabs per se in the law. And then it says, and for everyone else, here's the very long list of requirements you need to attain citizenship. And in the beginning, it was actually very, very difficult. During the first proposals of the law, there were a lot of protests. Palestinians organized strikes and major strikes and protests. Actually, the law was the initial citizenship law, as it was first proposed in 1951-52, was compared to apartheid. There are all kinds of really interesting stories I could tell you. But basically, the restrictions were alleviated a little bit in the final wording of the law, but it was still quite difficult, to the extent that in the 1980s, Israel had to amend the citizenship law because there were still thousands of people that were stateless. Thousands of Palestinians in the state still had no status because they had not been exactly at the right place at the right time when the census came, the pollsters came to kind of fill out their paperwork, or they had been denied citizenship for some reason. So there were thousands of stateless children, and for that reason the law was amended.
Was it to go right here, and then we'll come over here, and we'll work our way around them.
Yeah, I'm Steve France with Sabeel DC, and I'm interested in the current debate about declaring the Jewish state that has become a real mantra. And then Kerry and Obama seem to try to slip the noose a little bit by saying, well, the UN already declared it a Jewish state, so really everybody knows it. I don't know if you caught that, their little move on that.
The UN did that, but okay.
But when you were just saying that the partition resolution had all of these universal requirements, in what way was it a Jewish state in the minds of those who drafted and voted for that resolution 181?
So there's a lot of different ways. It's a great question. There are a lot of different ways to answer it. Just two anecdotes, and then I'll try to speak in a more meta way. First of all, when the Declaration of Independence was finally issued or declared in May of 1948, there had been months of writing it and thinking about it and whatever. And the overall emphasis in the Declaration of Independence had been on the Jewish nature of the state. This was a state for the Jews, set up by the Jews, fought for valiantly, et cetera, et cetera. And the language of democracy was kind of forced in at the last minute, at the final hour, because of the fear that knowing that Israel was going to have to apply to the UN, it was going to have to, at that time, it seemed like it might still have to comply with all of Resolution 181, which Israeli delegates to the United Nations letter said, no, we don't, because the Arab states invaded and there is no Palestinian state, and so the whole thing is bunk except for the parts that we want to apply. So, I mean, the language in the Declaration of Independence, which says, this is a Jewish state and a democratic state, the history of that text is very, very interesting. The second thing is, and I don't have the text with me, and unfortunately it's not actually in the book, but historians always have tons of tidbits they want to put in and they can't. There's actually a great argument from a parliamentary session from the early 1950s, I think, or the late, like 1949 or 1950, in which Ben-Gurion is arguing with someone in the Knesset who says, we want Transjordan, it was before Transjordan became Jordan, we want Transjordan to recognize that we're a Jewish state. And he said, Jewish state, schmooish state, we don't need that, we know what we are, what is all this nonsense? And as I've been reading this business in the press every day about, we demand that you you recognize that we're a Jewish state, I always think of Ben-Gurion, who's not actually my favorite guy, as you can imagine, but, he basically said, we run our country, we have a strong army, what do we need that, who cares, right? Like, we define ourselves, we don't need them to pay us lip service. Now I've... What resolution are you talking about? No. So in the resolution itself, there was to be a Jewish state, what was called a Jewish state, whatever name it was going to be granted, and an Arab state. But it was, the whole resolution was problematic because it was based on this idea that you're going to have a majority ethnic population or ethnic group in one state and another majority ethnic group in another. But what I was saying earlier in the talk was, even the Jewish state, as it was mapped out or the borders were defined in the Partition Plan, 50% of the population was going to be Palestinian Arab. So it was not really going to be a Jewish state in that sense. It's only a Jewish state in the sense that privilege is granted to Jews. And that's why my position in the book and now is Jewish citizens in Israel today should be thought of and defined still as settlers in the sense that the rights that they have today were granted to them or formulated in order to give a minority population, that is before the 48 war, preferential status. And that hasn't changed. It was a statistical kind of thing, and it was contested at the time. Exactly.
Go right here, and then we'll come across.
No, thank you very much. I just wondered if you could comment to what extent the use of closed zones in the 1950s and 60s to appropriate the land of refugees and others is parallel today in East Jerusalem and the West Bank to expropriate Palestinian land.
So, the laws evolve all the time everywhere, but the principle of establishing a closed zone and maintaining and intensifying or institutionalizing certain laws that say if you don't access your land or you don't farm your land within X number of years, then you forfeit your rights to it. That's the British British Empire never used the closed zone part of their emergency regulations to the same degree in their imperial possessions as Israel did after 1948. They were more interested in using the counterinsurgency clauses of their emergency laws. Things like if someone is sabotaging the regime, you can put them in jail without charge, things like that. So Israel really ramped up the land clauses and capacities of the military laws that it inherited from the British government. But certainly, and after 1967, Israel developed some new techniques. It borrowed from the existing techniques and other techniques. But these laws that it uses go back to British emergency laws, which were rooted in anti-colonial rebellions starting in the mid-19th century. So there are a lot of zigzags along the way, but there's a line there.
And before they adopted the emergency regulations, they were quite critical of the emergency regulations.
Absolutely. So in the mid-1940s, you had a lot of Jewish lawyers, for example, saying, "This is outrageous. This is basically you're creating an entire population of criminals." And that's exactly what the military regime did, and that's why I showed you the pictures of the military court, because it basically effectively criminalized the entire Palestinian population for doing things like trying to access their own land, trying to get medicine for their child, trying to visit their family. And the military government refused to publish maps. So even if people wanted to abide by the law, they couldn't because they didn't know where the borders of each zone were. So there was the point was to keep the population distracted and subordinated.
We're over on time, but we're going to take these last two questions, and if we could take them together and then maybe get a response, that would help out. So right here, we get the two questions back to back.
Okay, thank you, Shira. It's very good. I have a question on. Can you speak a little bit to the current controversy in Israel about removing the exemption from military service given to Orthodox Jews? Thank you.
I'm wondering what practical consequences there would be from accepting Israel as a Jewish state, given the state of discrimination against Palestinians that exists, aside from nullifying the law, aside from deciding once and for all against the right of Palestinians to return. Is that what the main effect would be, or are there others that would be a consequence of that?
The whole state is structured in such a way as to privilege Jews against Palestinians. So there's not one law, but many, many laws. You'd have to change the laws that discriminate against Palestinians in their access to land, in their ability to go to, have the same school tracking, their ability to get loans. That you would have to change laws that privilege Army veterans with loans and other jobs. Everything, housing, municipal allocations, there's almost no major sphere of law that you would not have to change. Simply saying, okay, it's no longer a Jewish state, it's the same thing as Ben Gurion. I don't care, Jewish, Shmuish, whatever, but you have to actually change the structures on the ground. Does that make sense?
One thing
Maybe I didn't understand.
Today, and it's timely because it's in the news this morning, the Israeli foreign minister is talking about the legal foundations of transferring Palestinian citizens of Israel to a would-be Palestinian state. So the implications of Palestinian recognition of not just the Jewish state, but actually the validity of permanent Jewish majoritarianism is what it is essentially recognizing that the state can do whatever it deems necessary to maintain a Jewish majority, has very dangerous implications for Palestinian citizens of Israel, because tomorrow the state may come and say, look, you recognize us as a Jewish state, take your Palestinians and go. So it's not just about the right of return, it's about many other things as well. I just wanted to add that. But on the question
about removing the exemption, there's been tension in Israel around this issue of the exemption of ultra-Orthodox Jews from army service for many years now. I think it's best left for a different discussion, both because I'm not an expert and because we're out of time, but I can talk to you afterwards about it.
We're Yeah, we're over on time, but if you want to chat afterwards, and I should
I'm here.
say, of course, the book, which is here, we have it. We have lots of copies of it. It's filled with lots of fascinating stuff. So please grab a copy, and I'm sure Shira would be happy to sign them as well. And we'll be selling them here shortly. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much.